नामों के बारे में मुस्तफा सज्जाद हैदर का एक शेर जिसमें सोच का एक इल्जाविया मिलता है।
मेरी हस्ती क्या फकत एक नाम से ताबीर थी, कुछ तो गुजरी कुछ गुजारी दास्तां समझा था मैं।
इसके बाद नामों के साथ वाबस्ता जबर को तंजिया अंदाज में बयान करते हुए इन्होंने गर्दान की शक्ल में काछे इशार चासत किए हैं।
नामों का जबर भी नहीं अब तो मुझे कबूल, रख नाम चौधरी यूं ही ऐंठा फिरूं मैं क्या। नामों को जबर भी नहीं अब तो मुझे कबूल, शहबाज नाम है तो कबूतर का खूं करूं। नामों को जबर भी नहीं अब तो मुझे कबूल, शाजी रखा जो नाम शुफ शुफ करूं मैं क्या। नामों को जबर भी नहीं अब तो मुझे कबूल, ताहिर रखा जो नाम तो लोटे से लटक जाऊं।
में इबाप इसी सब के बारे में एक अंग्रेजी जुबान में पॉडकास्ट मालाहजा फरमाइए किया।
Mustafa Sajjad Haider poses a question that strikes at the very core of how we perceive ourselves in his opening couplet, Meri hasti kya fakat ik naam se tabeer hai, kuch to guzri, kuch guzari dastan samjata main. He asks if a person's existence is merely defined by a name, contrasting that static label with the dynamic, lived experience of life as a story where some parts happen to us and some parts we actively shape. It is a profound opening because it challenges the fundamental social contract we enter into the moment we are born, long before we have the cognitive ability to choose who we want to be. It is such a resonant start because it sets up the conflict between the name and the hasty, or the essence of being. In South Asian literature and culture, the weight of a name isn't just about phonetics. It is a dense repository of history, lineage, and, quite frankly, baggage. Haider is tapping into this realization that we are often treated as historical artifacts rather than living beings. When he says he thought life was a story, he is reclaiming agency. A name is a title on a book, but the story inside is what he actually lived. Yet society often refuses to look past the cover. That refusal is exactly what he dismantles in his satirical gardan, or declension. For those unfamiliar with the term, a gardan in Urdu and Persian grammar is the systematic repetition and variation of a word. Haider uses this structure to mock what he calls the jabr, or the tyranny of names. He explicitly states, Namon ka jabr bi nahin ab to muhe kabul. I no longer accept this name-based oppression. He then goes through specific archetypes, like the name Chaudhry. In the feudal structures of Pakistan and North India, if you carry that name, there is a scripted expectation of strutting around with a certain pride, a specific way of asserting power over land and people. The satire there is biting. He is asking, why should a string of syllables dictate my posture or my politics? If my name is Chaudhry, must I adopt the feudal swagger? It is a performance. And he continues this with Shahbaz, which means royal falcon. The expectation is that a Shahbaz must be a predator, hunting down pigeons or those perceived as weaker. It is a critique of how names can trap us in cycles of violence or dominance. You are named after a bird of prey, so you are conditioned to believe that your nature is to strike, to kill, to be superior. Haider is laughing at the absurdity of letting a metaphor dictate one's morality. The humor gets even sharper, perhaps even a bit more irreverent, when he mentions tahir, which means pure or clean. He jokes about whether a tahir must hang himself from a loda, the traditional water pot used for ritual cleansing. It is a funny image, but the underlying point is serious. Names often carry religious or moralistic weights that are impossible to carry. If you are named the Pure One, every human mistake you make is seen as a betrayal of your identity. You are under constant surveillance by your own name. And he rounds it out with Shah Ji, a title often given to those claiming descent from the Prophet's family, who are frequently expected to be spiritual healers or dispensers of blessings. Haider mocks the shuf, the sound of blowing a mock blessing. He is calling out the performative piety that names demand. You aren't being holy because of a spiritual connection. You are doing it because your name tag says you should. This jabber, this tyranny, effectively turns the individual into a mascot for a group, a sect, or a caste. Research into the psychology of names, like the work of psychologist John Twenge, has shown that our names can significantly influence our self-esteem and even our career paths through what is called nominative determinism. But in the context Haider describes, it is more like social determinism via nomenclature. It raises the philosophical question of whether a human is first a human or first a name. In many societies, the name arrives before the person. Before a child even takes their first breath, they have been assigned a place in a hierarchy. If you are born into a specific caste-linked name, you inherit rivalries that are centuries old. You are born with enemies you haven't met and virtues you haven't earned. This herd mentality is precisely what blocks independent thought. How can you be open-minded if your very name is a wall built between you and the other? That is the chain Haider is trying to break. He is suggesting that these names act as social contracts we never signed. We are born into a pre-filled identity, and this isn't just a poetic concern. Sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu have talked about symbolic capital. A name like Syed or Kaun carries a different weight in a job interview or a social gathering in South Asia than a name associated with manual labor. People are essentially wearing their ancestors' resumes on their sleeves. Haider's rebellion is a rejection of this inherited script. He wants to know what happens if we stop performing the role the name demands. Which leads to a really beautiful, almost radical alternative, the idea of the blank page name. What if we moved away from names that signal caste, sect, or historical conflict? Instead of names that are heavy with the jobber of the past, what if we chose simple, nature-based, or concept-neutral names? Imagine a child named Suba A Now, or New Morning, or even just Muskurahat, or Laughter. These aren't just pretty names, they are meaning-neutral in terms of social stratification. They don't tell you who to hate or how to strut. They allow the child to write their own story from scratch. It is a liberating thought, though I imagine it would meet massive resistance. Naming is one of the ways families maintain purity and continuity. In many cultures, the act of naming is the first act of possession. By naming a child blankly, as you put it, you are essentially saying, I do not own your destiny. You are giving them a gift of anonymity from the weight of the past. It would force us to interact with each other as individuals. Instead of seeing a Chaudhry or a Shah, you would just see a person. It shifts the burden of proof from the name to the character. There is a psychological benefit here too. If a child isn't constantly reminded that they are a falcon or a pure one, they might feel more comfortable exploring their own flaws and their own unique strengths. They wouldn't feel like they are failing a historical legacy. The satirical genius of Haider's poem is that he uses humor to show how ridiculous these labels are. When you laugh at the Shahji doing shuf, you are essentially demystifying the power of the name. You're seeing the man behind the curtain. Exactly. Satire is often the most effective tool for dismantling social burdens because it makes the sacred look silly. By lampooning the expectations, he makes the jobber feel optional. He's telling his audience, look, you don't have to do this. You don't have to be the falcon. It is an invitation to authenticity. The poem isn't just about rejecting names. It's about embracing the hasty, the being that exists before the label is applied. It is about recognizing that our names are tools for communication, not cages for the soul. If we could actually implement this, if a generation grew up with names that were just light, positive concepts, we might see a real shift in how society functions. Think about the sectarian conflicts that are often fueled by identifying a person's sect just by their middle or last name. If those markers are gone, the us versus them narrative loses its most basic fuel. You can't hate someone for their category if you can't figure out their category just by hearing their name. It brings us back to that shared humanity. When you strip away the Chaudhry and the Shahbaz, you are left with two humans. The tragedy is that we have spent centuries building these names into fortresses. Haider's Gardan is like a series of small, humorous explosions meant to crack those walls. He is reminding us that while we might have been given a name, we were born a person. The name is a part of the dastan, or the story, but it shouldn't be the author of the story. It is a call to live life guzari, as something lived, rather than something guzri, something that just happened to us because of a label. The ultimate takeaway from Haider's verses is that we have the power to redefine ourselves. We can acknowledge the names we carry while refusing to be limited by them. We can choose to be the person who defines the name, rather than the name that defines the person. It is an act of intellectual and spiritual independence that requires a bit of humor and a lot of courage. It is the difference between being a character in someone else's play and being the playwright of your own life. Even if we can't change our legal names, we can change our relationship to them. We can stop strutting like the Chowdhury and start acting like the human we actually are. That is the true end of the Jabbar, the end of the tyranny. It is the realization that the name is just a word, but the life is a poem that we are still writing. Mustafa Sajjad Haider reminds us that identity is far more than a title on a birth certificate. It is the lived story of our choices and our character. If this conversation about the weight and freedom of names sparks something in you, please share it with someone who might be navigating their own dastan. Recommendations from person to person are how these ideas truly travel.